The night my father-in-law pointed across his $12,000 dining table, looked straight at my mother, and said out loud in front of 11 people, "Could someone remind the guests that this is a family dinner, not a charity event?" I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even change my expression. I picked up my water glass, took one slow sip, and set it back down, because I already knew something that everyone at that table didn't. 3 months earlier, I had opened a file on my work laptop, a file that had taken me 8 weeks to build, a file that, by the time that Christmas dinner ended, was already sitting in a federal investigator's inbox. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm a forensic accountant. I find the money people try to hide, and the story I'm about to tell you. I've been waiting 2 years to finally be allowed to share it. This one took everything I had. Let's get into it. My mother's name is Carol Cole. She has worked as a licensed practical nurse for 22 years. Night shifts, 12 hours, 3 to 4 nights a week. She did this while raising me alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio. I know what the inside of that apartment smelled like at 6 a.m. on a school day. Coffee she brewed the night before and reheated in a microwave. The faint chemical smell of the hand sanitizer she used at work. Sometimes antiseptic if she'd had a bad shift and forgotten to change before the drive home. She'd come through the door just as my alarm was going off, still in her scrubs, shoes off by the mat, and even after 12 hours on her feet, she would ask me one question. "Did you eat breakfast?" Don't lie to me. That was Carol. Never complained. Never made the tiredness my problem. Just showed up. Again and again and again. When I was in high school, there was a period when I was embarrassed by her job. Some of my classmates had parents who wore suits, drove new cars, took vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines. And my mother drove a 2004 Civic with a dent in the passenger door she'd never gotten fixed. Because fixing it meant missing a bill. I came home one afternoon and told her I'd told a kid at school she was a doctor. I don't know why I said it. I was 16 and stupid. She set her coffee mug down, looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Nathan, the day you're ashamed of honest work is the day I've failed you." I haven't failed you. Don't you make me start now. That was the last time I was ever ashamed of my mother. And I want you to remember that moment. Because what happened at that Christmas dinner table 15 years later was the first time in my adult life I had to fight every instinct not to flip the entire thing over. I met Diane Hargrove at a conference in Atlanta. She was sharp, funny, direct. She asked harder questions than most people in that room and didn't flinch when I pushed back. I liked her immediately. Her family was a different introduction. The Hargroves ran a mid-sized real estate development firm out of Cincinnati, Hargrove Property Group, about 40 years old, mostly residential and light commercial. On the surface, it looked like a clean, well-run family operation. Brick facade, good reviews, Civic Chamber Award plaques on a lobby wall. Her father, Robert Hargrove, had the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything important. At least, that was how he carried himself. He wore the kind of watch that cost more than some people's cars and shook your hand, like he was deciding something about you in the first 3 seconds. The first time I met him, he smiled and said, "Diane tells me you find money that goes missing. Useful skill." Then he laughed like it was a light thing. I laughed too, but something in the back of my mind pressed a small flag into the ground. The first time my mother visited Cincinnati to meet them, Diane and I had been together about a year. Carol wore her church cardigan and brought a homemade pecan pie. Robert shook her hand with 2 fingers instead of his whole hand. His wife, Patricia, said, "Oh, how darling you baked," the way you'd say it about a child who drew a picture. Mom smiled, the kind of smile that means nothing wrong here, baby, keep going. I knew that smile. I had been watching her aim it at people who underestimated her my whole life. I told myself it was just social awkwardness. All money manners. A learning curve. I told myself Diane was different from them. I told myself a lot of things. What I didn't know yet was that 6 months before I ever walked into their house, Hargrove Property Group had been doing something to people like my mother in 3 different counties, and they had been getting away with it for years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the Christmas dinner first. It was the second Christmas I'd spent with the Hargroves. 11 people at the table. Extended family, a business partner, a neighbor couple they always invited. Diane's sister, her husband, 2 kids under 10 who spent most of dinner under the table. Carol drove up from Columbus by herself. 4 hours. She wore a green blouse she'd bought on clearance and pressed with care. She brought the pecan pie again. This time 2 of them. Dinner started fine. The food was catered, absurdly good. Wine that cost more per glass than Carol's hourly rate. The conversation was what it always was at Hargrove tables. Half about deals, half about people, all of it designed to remind you where everyone ranked. About 40 minutes in, one of the neighbor couples mentioned they tried a new restaurant in town. Casual comment. The wife turned to my mother and asked politely, "Do you get out to restaurants much, Carol? When you have time off?" Mom smiled and said something about a diner she loved near the hospital. Said the pie there wasn't as good as homemade, but the coffee was the best she'd had. A few people laughed warmly. Normal dinner conversation. Robert Hargrove had not been part of the exchange. He was cutting his roast at the head of the table. He looked up without really looking up, voice flat and carrying. "Someone remind the guest that this is a family dinner, not a charity event." He said it like a throwaway line, like a man who had never had to consider the weight of his words, because no one had ever required it of him. The table went quiet in that specific way where everyone hears everything and pretends they didn't. Diane's sister looked at her plate. The neighbor wife's smile didn't move for a full 3 seconds. Carol put her fork down, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at the centerpiece like she was memorizing it. That was her tell. That's what she did when something cut through. Not the thin smile, not the practiced calm. She just went quiet and very, very still. I looked at Robert. He had already moved on, refilling his wine, saying something to the man beside him, not even aware enough of what he'd done to be embarrassed. That was the worst part. He didn't mean to wound her. She just wasn't real enough to him to wound intentionally. She was background, texture, part of the scene. I picked up my water glass, took one slow sip, set it down, because if I opened my mouth right then, I would not stop. And I needed to wait, because what was already sitting in my work laptop was worth more than anything I could have said out loud in that room. Let me take you back 3 months before that dinner. I work for a firm that handles forensic accounting for a range of clients. Private companies, government entities, legal cases. We find discrepancies. We follow money trails. We build the kind of documentation that holds up in front of a judge. In September, A colleague forwarded me a referral from a legal aid nonprofit. 3 families in Hamilton County, Ohio, had been pushed out of long-term rental homes through a process that felt legally thin, possibly fraudulent. The nonprofit wanted a financial review to see if there was a pattern. The referral came with a name: Hargrove Property Group. I want to tell you I handed it off immediately. Then I flagged the conflict of interest and walked away. I didn't. I told myself it was probably nothing. I told myself it would clear their name. I told myself I was the most qualified person at the firm for this type of file. All that was true. None of it was the real reason I opened the folder. I had watched my mother fold her hands in her lap at that family's table. I had watched her swallow things she should never have had to swallow. And some part of me, the part that grew up watching her absorb other people's carelessness, needed to know what these people actually were. What I found took 8 weeks to document fully. Hargrove Property Group had been acquiring residential properties in 3 counties, targeting long-term rentals occupied by elderly tenants, single-parent households, and working-class families. Tenants who had been in those homes for 10, 15, sometimes 20 years. The pattern was specific and consistent. They would purchase a property, then issue a series of escalating lease violations. Minor things: a gutter that needed cleaning, a crack in a driveway, issues that had existed for years under previous ownership with no complaint. Suddenly documented, suddenly urgent, suddenly grounds for non-renewal. Tenants who pushed back received legal notices from a firm that had no public address. Tenants who couldn't afford legal counsel, which was most of them, left. Once the properties were vacant, Hargrove flipped them within 18 months. Average profit per property between $60,000 and $90,000. 41 properties. 3 counties. 7 years. I built the file. Transaction by transaction. Lease by lease. Notice by notice. And then I did something I had never done before in my professional life. I wrote a cover memo, addressed it to a federal housing oversight contact I'd worked with twice before, and I attached every page. I sent it the night of December 21st, 3 days before Christmas dinner. Stay with me, because what my supervisor said when she read the file on December 26th, I didn't expect that either. The drive back to Columbus from that Christmas dinner took 4 hours. Mom followed me in her Civic. I watched her headlights in my rearview mirror the whole way. We stopped at a rest area around midnight. She got out, stretched, poured bad vending machine coffee into a paper cup. I walked over and stood next to her. "You didn't have to do this, she said. "Come for Christmas. You could have told them no." "I wanted to be there," I said. She looked at me sideways. "You've been carrying something for months." She had always been able to read me better than any instrument I'd ever built. I didn't tell her about the file that night. I wasn't sure it would go anywhere. Federal referrals can sit for months. I didn't want to give her something to carry if it came to nothing. But on December 26th, at 7:42 in the morning, my phone lit up. Email from a name I recognized. The federal contact. Subject line: Hargrove Property Group, preliminary review. The message was 3 sentences. "Mr. Cole, we have reviewed your submission. We are opening a formal inquiry. Please do not contact the subjects of this referral. You will hear from our office within 30 days. I read it 3 times. Then I got up, made coffee, and went to work. Because there was nothing to do now but wait. And waiting, I had learned from my mother, was something you did quietly. I need to tell you about Diane honestly, because this isn't a story where the person you love is simply a villain. It's more complicated and more painful. Diane had grown up inside her family's decisions the way you grow up inside a house. You don't question the walls. You don't ask why the layout is what it is. It was just the structure of things. When I told her in January, after the inquiry was confirmed, what I had found, what I had submitted, what was now moving forward without my control, she sat at my kitchen table and didn't speak for a long time. My father doesn't know you did this. No, I said. He's going to think I helped you. I know. She looked at me. Did you want him to think that? I thought about that question for a while. No, I said finally. I wanted the 41 families to get a fair outcome. And I wanted to stop being the person who smiles at a table where my mother is invisible. Diane and I did not survive this. I want to be honest about that. She stayed for 3 months after I told her. We tried, but the distance between what I had done and what her family expected of her was too wide. Some gaps are too wide to stand across without losing your footing. She called me the night before the story broke publicly, just to say, I know you did the right thing. I'm just not able to be there for it. It was the most honest thing she ever said to me, and it cost her something real. I could hear it in her voice. The federal inquiry took 11 months. I was not directly involved once I submitted the file. My role was to provide documentation when asked, which I did 3 times. The findings, when they were made public, covered 43 properties across 4 counties. Robert Hargrove and 2 senior managers of Hargrove Property Group were charged with a pattern of fraudulent lease enforcement, an unlawful tenant displacement targeting protected classes. Robert did not go to trial immediately. His lawyers are good and well paid, but the company's license was suspended pending investigation. Their contracts with 3 municipal housing programs were voided. Their credit lines were frozen. Hargrove Property Group, which had operated for 40 years, is currently in receivership. Of the 43 displaced families identified in the inquiry, 31 received financial settlements through a remediation process overseen by a housing advocacy nonprofit. Not everything, not enough, but something. Something where there had been nothing. Patricia Hargrove released a statement saying the family disputed all findings and looked forward to clearing their name through proper legal channels. I read it on my phone at the same kitchen table where I had built the file. Then I set the phone face down and went to call my mother. Carol picked up on the second ring. She had seen the news. Her hospital had people who followed local real estate stories. Word travels in places where people have been displaced. Nathan, Mom, silence for a moment. The kind that isn't empty. You didn't have to do that for me, she said. I know, I said. I did it because of you. Another silence. Those families, she said. Did they get something? 31 of them. Yes, she exhaled. Long and slow. Good, she said. Then it mattered. She didn't ask about Robert. She didn't ask about Diane. She didn't ask what came next for me. She asked about the families. That was Carol. That is Carol. That night, I sat in my apartment and thought about what Robert had said at that table. Said without looking up. Said like background noise. The guest who didn't belong. He had spent 40 years building a company on the principle that some people were furniture and some people were owners. That rent was extraction, not relationship. That a woman in a clearance blouse bringing 2 pecan pies was a charity case, not a guest. What he had never counted on was the furniture knowing how to read a balance sheet. I'm not telling you this story to be celebrated. I'm telling it because I think a lot of people have sat at tables where they didn't belong, according to someone else's definition, and they swallowed it and kept swallowing because they thought swallowing was the only option. My mother taught me something important without ever framing it as a lesson. She taught me that dignity isn't given to you by the people at the head of the table. It's what you bring through the door. Robert Hargrove called her a guest who didn't belong. He was right about one thing. She didn't belong in a room where people like him made decisions for people like her. But that was his problem, not hers. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever sat at a table, literally or figuratively, where someone made you feel invisible? And what did you do about it? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. If this story meant something to you, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, real, unfiltered, and worth your time, subscribe. A new story drops every week. I'll see you in the next one.